1,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a number of servants so large that the biblical text doesn't even bother to count. It simply says there were very many. We are talking about the richest man in all the East, not of a city, not of a region, of all the East. Job 1.3 is direct. This man was the greatest of all the people of the East. But what did that mean in practice? What was it like to wake up being Job? What did he see from the door of his tent? How many people depended on him for food? And most importantly, how does a man with all this end up sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping his own skin with a shard of pottery? The answer begins long before the tragedy. It starts in the day-to-day of a personal empire that most of us can't even imagine. To understand Job's life, you first need to understand where he lived. Bible says Job was from the land of Uz, and Uz was no ordinary place. Most scholars place Uz in a region that would today correspond to northern Arabia, possibly between southern Jordan and northwestern Saudi Arabia, an area that in antiquity was east of Israel, between the Syrian desert and the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt. Others point to Edom, the land of Esau's descendants, based on Lamentations, which mentions Uz and Edom together. Either way, we are talking about a semi-arid landscape. Rocky hills covered in low shrubs, wide valleys where grass grew during the rainy season, and plains that stretched to the horizon. By day, the sun beat down on the limestone rocks with an intensity that made the air shimmer above the ground. At night, the temperature plummeted, and the sky opened up in a blanket of stars so dense it seemed solid. In this setting, Job was not just rich. He was what the ancients would call a tribal prince, a patriarch, whose influence extended for miles in every direction. And when the Bible lists his wealth, it is using the economic language of the time. 7,000 sheep is not a random number, it is an absurd logistical operation. Each sheep needs about 4 liters of water a day. 7,000 sheep is 28,000 liters of water daily, just for the sheep. Now add 3,000 camels, which drink between 100 and 150 liters at a time when they reach a well. Add 500 yoke of oxen, that is 1,000 oxen, plus 500 female donkeys. We are talking about tens of thousands of liters of water a day to keep these animals alive. This required wells, cisterns, and natural springs. Job didn't just control animals, he controlled water. And in the ancient East, whoever controlled the water controlled life. Think about the size of the operation. 7,000 sheep need pasture. In the semi-arid region of Uz, each sheep needs somewhere between 2 and 4 hectares of land to graze throughout the year because the vegetation is sparse and grows slowly. This means Job's flock required between 14,000 and 28,000 hectares of grazing land, an area equivalent to an entire medium-sized city. And these sheep weren't all kept together. It would be impossible. They were divided into smaller flocks, each with its shepherd, each in a different region, moving according to the season, seeking fresh pasture and water sources. The 3,000 camels had another function. Camels in the ancient East were the equivalent of a fleet of cargo trucks combined with an interstate transport network. Each camel carried between 150 and 250 kilograms of merchandise and could travel 40 kilometers a day in the desert without needing water for a week. 3,000 camels meant Job had the capacity to move up 600 tons of merchandise at once. This is state-level logistics. Most likely, these camels operated in trade caravans, crossing the routes between Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Arabia, transporting spices, insects, myrrh, fabrics, and metals. Each trip generated a fortune. The 500 yoke of oxen reveal another fundamental detail. A yoke of oxen is a harnessed pair. That's 1,000 oxen in total. And oxen were used to plow the land. 500 yokes ploughing at the same time meant Job cultivated an enormous amount of agricultural land. He wasn't just an animal breeder, he was a grain producer on an industrial scale for the time. Barley, wheat, possibly lentils and chickpeas. These crops fed not only his family and his servants, but likely supplied regional markets. The 500 female donkeys had a more specific function. Female donkeys in the ancient East were valued for their milk, considered medicinal and nutritious, and for light transport in rugged terrain where camels couldn't pass. They were the utility vehicles, the jeeps of the operation. Now put it all together, thousands of animals, hundreds of shepherds, long-distance transport operations, agricultural fields, wells, cisterns, warehouses and trade routes. Job was not just a rich man. He was the CEO of a conglomerate that employed possibly hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. And each of these people, with their families, depended on him. If you believe that God's plan for a person can manifest in abundance before manifesting in trial, comment, "God is sovereign." And here enters a detail that the biblical text mentions almost in passing, but which completely changes the image we have of Job. The Bible says he was the greatest of all the people of the East. This expression, people of the East, in Hebrew Bnei Kedem, was not generic. It referred to a specific class of tribal leaders and sages who inhabited the lands east of Israel. These men were known throughout the ancient world for their wisdom. 1 Kings says that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East. In other words, the reference point is Solomon. And Job was the greatest among these men. He was not just the richest. He was recognized the wisest, the most just, and the most respected of an entire class of leaders who were already legendary in antiquity. So what was the daily life of this man like? Let's reconstruct it. The sun has not yet risen, and Job is already up. The first thing he does, before any meeting, before checking any flock, before any business decision, is to offer sacrifices to God. Job 1:5 is explicit. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings for each of his 10 children. 10 children, 10 sacrifices every day. Imagine the scene. The darkness of the desert still covers the camp. The stars are fading on the eastern horizon. The air is cold. In this region, the pre-dawn hours can reach 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. And there is Job before an altar of stacked stones, with the fire crackling, the smell of burnt meat rising in the still morning air. He offers each animal, thinking of each child individually. The text says he did this because he thought, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Not in their actions, in their hearts. Job was not worried about visible sins. He was worried about the internal attitude of his children before God. This level of spirituality is impressive. And now think about what this reveals about the character. Job lived in an era before the Mosaic law, before Moses, before the Levitical priests, before the tabernacle, and before the temple. There was no institutionalized religious system. There was no written commandment saying, make sacrifices for your children every morning. Job did this on his own initiative. He was the priest of his family, and not a careless priest, an obsessive, meticulous priest who did not let a single day pass without covering his children before God. God himself recognizes this. In Job 1:8, when God speaks to Satan, he says, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one on earth like him, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." No one on earth. It is not Job who calls himself righteous. It is God. After the sacrifices, Job's day unfolded in pure administration. And here we need to understand something that a superficial reading of the Bible doesn't show. Being the richest man in the East was an exhausting job. Every day, messengers arrived from different regions bringing information. How many sheep were born? How many died? where the pasture dried up, where a water source was found, whether a camel caravan reached its destination, or if it was attacked by raiders in the desert. Because yes, raiders were a constant threat. The book of Job itself mentions the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans as groups that attacked caravans and stole flocks. Security was a daily concern. Job needed to keep armed men patrolling the borders of his lands, protecting the most distant shepherds, and escorting the trade caravans. He didn't live in an isolated palace counting gold coins. He lived at the center of a living, pulsing logistical network, full of real problems that needed immediate solutions. But Job had something that no other tribal leader in the East had in the same measure. He had a moral reputation, and that, in the ancient world, was the most valuable currency in existence. Job chapters 29 and 31 are an extraordinary self-portrait, probably the most complete description the Bible gives of how a righteous man lived in practice, and the details are impressive. Job 29:7 says that when he went to the city gate, the center of decisions and judgments at the time, the young men stepped aside out of respect, and the elders rose and stood. The princes stopped speaking. The nobles covered their mouths with their hands. The whole city fell silent when Job spoke, not out of fear, out of reverence, because everyone knew that what came out of his mouth was just. And why all this reverence? Because Job was not a rich man who ignored the poor. Job 29:12-17 describes a list of actions that sound like the mission statement of a modern humanitarian organization. He delivered the poor who cried out, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one who was about to perish came upon him. He made the widow's heart sing for joy. He clothed himself in righteousness as one puts on a garment. He was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He was a father to the needy. And, an impressive detail, he personally investigated the legal cases of people he didn't even know. If someone was being unjustly oppressed, Job went after it. He broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the prey from their teeth. This is not the language of passive charity. It is the language of combat. Job confronted the powerful who exploited the weak. He used his wealth and influence as a shield for those who had no defense. This explains why God called him blameless and upright. It wasn't just personal piety, it was active justice. Job was doing with his own fortune exactly what God expected to be done with wealth. He didn't accumulate, he distributed. He didn't dominate, he protected. And the whole system worked. The thousands of employees were well treated. The poor of the region were assisted. The flocks prospered. Caravans brought wealth. The children feasted. And every morning, before everything else, the altar smoked. It was too perfect to last. And here the story takes a turn that no one in the land of Uz could have predicted. Because while Job lived his daily life, managing, judging, sacrificing, protecting, something was happening in a place where he had neither eyes nor ears. A place where his moral walls, his wealth, and his reputation were worth absolutely nothing. The Bible says in Job 1:6, "One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." Stop and process this. There is a scene in the book of Job that takes place off the earth. The sons of God, an expression that in the original Hebrew is Bene Ha-Elohim, generally interpreted as angelic beings, came to present themselves before God. This has the language of a royal court, like officials presenting themselves before a king to give an account. And in their midst, like someone infiltrating a meeting where they weren't invited, appears Satan. And what does God do? Here is the detail that has disturbed theologians for millennia. God does not ignore Satan. God does not cast him out. God strikes up a conversation. "Where have you come from?" And Satan responds with a phrase loaded with arrogance, "From roaming through the earth and walking around on it." He doesn't say from watching, from serving, or from fulfilling orders. He says he was walking around, inspecting. Like someone examining territory they consider their own. And then God does something that shocked Job, and shocks everyone who reads the text carefully. God points to Job. God himself brings Job's name into the conversation. Have you considered my servant Job? It's as if God were placing Job in the center of a cosmic spotlight. Look at this man. There is no one like him on earth. Blameless, upright, fearing God, shunning evil. If this surprised you, if you didn't know it was God who brought up Job's name and not the devil, comment, "I didn't know." Satan's response is one of the most revealing phrases in the entire Bible. He says, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" This question is a theological bombshell. What Satan is saying is, Job is only faithful because he is paid to be. Take away the payment and the faithfulness disappears. He doesn't love God, he loves what God gives. And then Satan goes further. He says something that reveals he has been watching Job closely, studying every detail of the operation. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? A hedge, a living fence, a barrier of protection. Satan is saying, I tried to get to him and I couldn't. There is an invisible wall around Job, his family and his possessions. I can't touch anything. This is the hedge, the divine protection that covered every aspect of Job's life. And here is what makes this scene so disturbing. Satan proposes a test. Stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he'll surely curse you to your face. And God accepts. God says, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. The fence was opened, the protection was turned off, and Job doesn't know. This is the most brutal detail of the whole story. Job receives no warning. There is no angel who appears at dawn saying, prepare yourself. There is no prophetic dream. There is absolutely nothing. While Job wakes up that morning, offers his 10 sacrifices as he does every day, checks his messengers, and dispatches his caravans, while everything seems perfectly normal, the shield that protected him since the beginning no longer exists. And the blows that follow will be so fast, so precise and so devastating that Job will not even have time to process one before the next one arrives. But before we get to the destruction, we need to understand something that almost no one stops to consider. We need to understand what Job had to lose, not in numbers. We've already seen that. In affection, in meaning, in a life built over decades. Job's 10 children were not names on a list. They were people he saw born, saw grow, and saw become adults. 7 men and 3 women. And the text of Job 1:4 reveals a detail that shows how this family functioned. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Each son had his own house. Each one organized parties and included the sisters. This shows a united, prosperous and affectionate family. It wasn't a family divided by inheritance disputes, and there was plenty of inheritance to create conflict. They gathered. They celebrated together. The sisters were included, which in the culture of the time was a sign of uncommon respect. And Job, after each round of parties, would offer sacrifices for all of them. Each one, individually. Because he loved each one to the point of losing sleep, thinking about their souls. Imagine what it meant to be invited to a banquet at the house of one of Job's sons. The tent would be the largest in the region, woven with dark goat hair on the outside, lined with colorful rugs on the inside. The floor was covered with cushions and mats of braided straw. In the center, a low fire with embers that illuminated the room with an orange glow. Servants bringing trays of roasted lamb with herbs, warm unleavened bread, goat cheese, dates, dried figs, pomegranates, and wine mixed with spices. The sound of conversation, laughter, and possibly musical instruments, harps, tambourines, the aroma of meat seasoned with cumin and coriander mixing with the sweet smell of fruit. And outside, the cold and silent desert, while inside the tent, life was warm and abundant. This is what Job was going to lose. Not an estate, a life. And there was another aspect of Job's wealth that is rarely discussed: responsibility. When the Bible says he had very many servants, it is describing entire families who lived under Job's protection. These servants were not slaves in the modern sense. Many were free workers, bound to a tribal lord by loyalty and necessity. Shepherds who cared for the flocks with their wives and children, farmers who plowed the fields, caravaneers who traveled for weeks in the desert, artisans who sheared sheep, tanned leather, made cheese, and built enclosures, women who spun wool, cooked and cared for the children. All these people ate, drank, and lived because Job managed things well. Every wrong decision could leave hundreds of people without food. Every drought he didn't foresee, every trade route he didn't protect, every conflict he didn't resolve, everything had a direct human consequence. Job himself, in chapter 31, verses 13 to 15, says that he never rejected the cause of a male or female servant when they had a complaint against him. He listened to them. He treated them as equals before God. Did not he who made me in the womb make them? He asks. This is a level of social consciousness that sounds modern, but Job was living this possibly even before Abraham. So let's recap the full scenario. We have a man who controls an operation with thousands of animals, hundreds or thousands of workers, long-distance trade routes, vast agricultural fields, and political influence over an entire region. This same man wakes up at dawn every day to offer sacrifices for his children. He is eyes to the blind, feet to the lame, and a father to the orphan. When he speaks, princes fall silent. When he judges, justice is done. God in person calls him the best man on earth. And it is exactly this entire life, built brick by brick over decades of honest work, genuine devotion and active justice, that is about to be demolished in a single day. Not in weeks, not gradually, in hours. 4 messengers will come running, one after the other, each bringing news worse than the last. So fast that the biblical text uses a phrase that has become famous. While he was still speaking, another came. Still speaking. Job doesn't even finish processing one blow, and the next one is already at the door. But what exactly happens on that day, and how Job reacts in a way no one expected, is what comes next. The day begins like any other. Job wakes up before the sun, walks to the altar and offers 10 sacrifices. The smell of smoke rises in the freezing morning air. He watches the embers consume the last offering. Perhaps he takes a deep breath. Perhaps he looks at the sky and feels that everything is in order, because it is. The flocks are in the pastures. The camels are on the roots. The children are alive. The servants are working. Job's world is whole. And then the first messenger appears on the horizon. He is running, not walking, running. And in the desert, no one runs without a reason. The human body does not waste energy like that in an environment where the heat can kill. If a man is running in the desert, it is because something terrible has happened. The messenger arrives breathless, covered in dust, and speaks. Job 1:14 to 15. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Process what just happened. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, all the servants who were with them, dead. The Sabeans were nomadic tribes from southern Arabia, from the region that is today Yemen. Warriors who attacked caravans and settlements as a way of survival. They didn't come to negotiate, they came with swords, and they killed everyone except one. This detail, I am the only one who has escaped, will be repeated 4 times, 4 messengers, 4 disasters, and in all of them, exactly 1 person survives, 1 witness, enough to tell the story, enough so that Job knows exactly what he lost. This is no coincidence within the narrative. It is surgery. Each blow is calculated to cause maximum pain with maximum clarity. Job is still processing the first news when the text says, and this is the phrase that defines the entire rhythm of the destruction, while he was still speaking, another came. Another messenger. Another man running. Another face covered in terror. And this time, the news doesn't come from the earth. It comes from the sky. Job 1:16, the fire of God fell from the heavens, and burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you, the fire of God. The messenger uses this expression, fire of God. Probably lightning, a violent electrical storm in the desert, something that ancients could only explain as direct intervention from heaven. 7,000 sheep, burned, all the shepherds who were with them, dead. And notice the theological cruelty of this detail. The messenger says it was the fire of God. Imagine what that does to the head of a man who just offered sacrifices to that same God that very morning. The God to whom Job dedicated every morning now seems to be attacking Job himself. The smoke of the sacrifices rose in the morning as worship. The smoke of the sheep rises now as destruction. The symmetry is terrifying, and there is no pause. There is no time for Job to sit down, to cry, or to ask why. While he was still speaking, another came, third messenger, Job 1:17. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The Chaldeans, a people from Mesopotamia, from the region that is now southern Iraq. Organized, strategic warriors. They didn't attack in a mass. They divided into 3 bands. They surrounded the camels from 3 flanks. This is military tactics. 3,000 camels, Job's entire transport fleet, the backbone of his long-distance trade, destroyed in a single coordinated action, and once again, all the servants dead. Each of these servants had a name, had a family, had children waiting for their father to return from work. None returned. Stop and add up the damage so far. In a matter of minutes, perhaps an hour, perhaps less, Job lost 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and an untold number of servants. His entire operation was decimated. Decades of work, planning, investment and expansion, all reduced to ashes, blood and silence. If the story stopped here, it would already be the worst tragedy in the ancient East. But it doesn't stop here, because the 4th messenger is already running, and he doesn't bring news about animals. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Read it again. Read it slowly. 10 children, 7 men and 3 women. They were together. They were celebrating. They were doing exactly what they always did, gathering at the firstborn's house, eating, drinking, and being a family. And a wind, a single violent desert wind, possibly what we today call a shamal, a sandstorm with winds that can exceed 100 kilometers per hour, hit the 4 corners of the house at the same time. The entire structure collapsed. The wooden beams, the adobe walls, the roof of straw and mud, everything on top of them, all dead, all of them. every child for whom Job offered sacrifices every morning, every name he pronounced before the altar while the fire burned, every face he saw born, grow, and become an adult, erased in a gust of wind. And now imagine what is happening inside Job. 4 messengers in sequence, 4 chain disasters, oxen, sheep, camels, children. The escalation is deliberate. It starts with material goods and ends with the flesh of his flesh. It starts with what can be replaced and ends with what can never be restored. And all of this is falling on a man who until that morning was called by God the best man on earth. What agreement did he break? What commandment did he disobey? What sin did he commit? None. Absolutely none. That is the point of the story. And Job's reaction is the most impressive scene in the entire book. Job 120. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship. Each of these actions has meaning. Tearing the robe was the ultimate expression of mourning in the ancient world. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was visceral. You grabbed the fabric with both hands and tore it downward, exposing your chest. It was like ripping off a layer of your own skin. It was saying with your body, I am being destroyed from within. Shaving the head was another mark of deep mourning. In the ancient East, hair represented dignity and identity. Shaving it all was giving up everything you were. It was saying, I am no longer who I was. And then, after the torn robe, after the shaved head, after the whole ritual of despair, Job throws himself to the ground, but not to writhe in pain, to worship, to worship. And the words that come out of his mouth are perhaps the most quoted in the entire Old Testament. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Read it again. This man has just lost everything. Possessions, servants, children, all 10 in hours. And the first thing he says is not why. It's not an accusation. It's not a curse. It's a theological declaration of a depth that theologians have studied for 3,000 years. He begins with nakedness. Naked I came, naked I will return. Everything I had was on loan. I brought nothing with me when I was born. I will take nothing when I die. So nothing was really mine. Then the attribution, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Job does not blame the Sabaeans. He does not blame the Chaldeans. He does not blame the wind. He looks through all the secondary causes and points directly to the first cause, God. God gave. God took away. And finally, and here's what makes Satan lose the first bet, may the name of the Lord be praised. Not cursed, praised. Job does exactly the opposite of what Satan predicted. The next verse is the verdict. Job 1:22. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. He did not sin. This is the answer to Satan's question. Does Job fear God for nothing? Yes, he does. The payment was withdrawn. The blessing was removed. The fence was torn down. Everything was taken. And Job continues to worship. Satan was wrong. Job's faith was not transactional. It was not based on what he received. It was based on who God is. And that should have been the end of the story. It should have been. But it isn't. Because the heavenly scene repeats itself. Job chapter 2 opens exactly like chapter 1. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and again Satan appears among them. Again God asks where he came from. Again Satan says he was roaming and walking through the earth, and again God points to Job. But this time there is an additional line that changes everything. God says, "Have you considered my servant Job? He still maintains his integrity. You incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." Without any reason. God himself admits, in God's own mouth, these words, that Job was destroyed without cause, without motive, without sin, without a reason that justified what happened. And this divine admission is one of the most difficult phrases in the entire biblical text. Because if God knows it was without cause, why did he allow it? Satan does not give up. He has a second thesis, and this one is even crueler than the first. Skin for skin, he says. A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Skin for skin, a commercial proverb of the time. It meant something like, one thing is exchanged for another equivalent. Satan is arguing. Of course, Job gave up his possessions and his children without blaspheming, because he still has his own health. A person will trade anything to keep their own body intact. The price hasn't reached his flesh yet. Touch his flesh. Then you will see who Job really is. And God once again accepts. Very well then, he is in your hands. But you must spare his life. What follows is described in a single sentence that carries more suffering than whole pages of other books. Job 2.7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. No part of the body spared. Scholars debate exactly what disease this was. Some suggest elephantiasis, others a severe form of psoriasis, others a generalized bacterial infection. What the text describes throughout the book gives us clues. The skin darkened and peeled, worms bred in the open wounds, the whole body swelled. The fever was constant. The pain was so intense that Job could not sleep. His breath became unbearable. Job himself says his wife was repulsed by his smell. The children of the city mocked him in the street. His closest friends did not recognize him when they saw him. This man, who weeks before was revered when he entered the city gate, before whom princes were silent, is now sitting on a pile of ashes outside the city, scraping his sores with a shard of pottery. Job 2:8. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. The image is one of absolute degradation. The ashes are not poetic. It was the city dump, the place where garbage, remains of sacrifices, and waste were thrown. It was where lepers and the impure were sent. Job went from the center of power to the trash heap, from the altar of worship to the mound of ashes, from the fine robe to the naked body covered in sores. And the instrument he uses to relieve the pain, a shard of pottery, is the most primitive thing there is. There is no balm, no medicine, and no doctor. There is a piece of broken ceramic that he passes over the infected skin, trying to scrape off the scabs, trying to clean the pus, trying to feel anything that isn't pain. And it is at this moment, at this exact moment, with Job sitting in the ashes, covered in ulcers, without children, without possessions, and without dignity, that the person who should be his greatest support appears, his wife, the woman who stood by him for decades, who saw the wealth being built, who gave birth to the 10 children who are now dead, who carries her own grief, her own pain, her own despair, and what she says is one of the most debated phrases in the entire Bible. Job 2:9. Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Some theologians throughout history have condemned this woman. Augustine called her the devil's instrument, but others, and rightly so, look at this phrase with more compassion. She also lost everything. Those same 10 children were hers. The same wealth sustained her life. And now she sees her husband wasting away on a pile of trash, covered in wounds, and she knows he did nothing wrong. Nothing. She lived with him for decades. She knows he is blameless. And it is precisely because of this that she cannot bear it. If he were guilty, the pain would have an explanation. But he is innocent, and he suffers like this. What is the sense? So she says, despair screams when logic breaks. Curse God and end it. Job's response is short, direct, and devastating. You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And again, the text concludes, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. He did not sin with his lips. This specification is curious. The text says he did not sin with his mouth. That is, he did not blaspheme. He did not curse. But the text does not say he did not suffer inside. It doesn't say he understood. It doesn't say he accepted it with serenity, only that he did not verbalize a curse against God. The pain was there. The confusion was there. The questions were piling up like pressure inside a boiler, and this pressure is going to explode, not in blasphemy, but in something few expect. Because what Job is going to do next is not accept in silence. It is to confront. It is to question. It is to demand answers. And he will do this looking directly upward. And it is exactly at this moment that three figures appear on the horizon. Three men who heard what happened to Job and traveled from distant regions to visit him. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. Three friends Job had known for years, possibly decades, wealthy, wise, respected men in their own lands. They agreed to come together. The text says they made an appointment with each other before going. They came with a stated purpose, to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they arrive, when they finally catch sight of Job, something happens that reveals the real dimension of the destruction. Job 2:12. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They didn't recognize him. These men knew Job. They knew his face, his bearing, and his imposing presence. And now, looking at that skeletal figure covered in sores sitting on a pile of ashes, they cannot identify their friend. The reaction is immediate. They wept aloud, tore their robes, and sprinkled dust on their heads. And then they did something extraordinary. They sat with him on the ground in silence, 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. 7 days of silence, a whole week in which 4 men sit in the ashes, staring at nothing, breathing the smell of open sores and hearing only the desert wind. This is the period of Shiva, the 7-day Jewish mourning that persists to this day. And during these 7 days, Job is accumulating. Every hour that passes without an answer is another question that piles up. Every night without sleep is another layer of anguish. 7 days for a man who lost everything is an eternity. And when the silence is finally broken, it is Job who speaks first. And what comes out of his mouth is not worship. It is not blessed be the name of the Lord. He had already said that. Now, 7 days later, something different emerges, something raw, something that many people would not expect to find in the Bible. Job chapter 3, verse 1. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He did not curse God, that he refuses to do, but he cursed the day he was born. May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived. Job wishes he had never existed. He wishes the day of his birth were erased from the calendar, that night had been eternal darkness, that he had died in the womb, that he had gone from the uterus straight to the grave. Because, he asks, and this is the question that will echo for the next 30 chapters, why is light given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul? Why does God give life to someone only to make that life unbearable? This is the beginning of the greatest theological debate of the Old Testament, and Job's 3 friends who came to comfort will become, one by one, his accusers. Eliphaz is the first to speak, and he begins with politeness, almost with delicacy. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? He recognizes that Job is suffering. He recognizes that it is hard to hear anything in this state. But then comes the thesis, and it is a thesis that will poison the entire conversation that follows. Eliphaz says, consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? It is subtle. It is almost gentle in tone, but the logic is a knife. What Eliphaz is saying is simple. The innocent do not suffer. The upright are not destroyed. If you are suffering like this, Job, you did something. You may not know what. You may not remember. but you did it, because God is just, and a just God does not destroy those who do not deserve it. This is the theology of retribution in its purest form. The idea that life works like a mathematical scale. Good actions generate good consequences, and bad actions generate bad consequences. If you are rich, God has approved of you. If you are sick, God has punished you. And this logic was not exclusive to Eliphaz. It was the consensus of the ancient world. It was what every sage taught. It was what the Proverbs repeated. And in a normal situation with normal people, this logic even seemed to work. The problem is that Job is not a normal situation. Job is the test that exposes the flaw in the entire system. Bildad goes further. He doesn't have Eliphaz's diplomacy. He looks at Job, covered in sores, sitting in the trash, and says, "When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin." Read it again. Bildad is saying that Job's children died because they deserved it, that the wind that knocked down the house was divine justice, that those 10 young people, eating, drinking, and celebrating together, carried some secret sin and received what was due to them. For a father who just buried 10 children, this phrase is worse than any disease. It is a red-hot iron pressed directly against an open wound. Zophar, the third, is the most aggressive of all. He doesn't even try to comfort. Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce others to silence? Zophar is calling Job arrogant. He is saying he talks too much, that he should accept the punishment in silence. And then he fires off. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin, less than he deserves. In Zophar's view, Job is not suffering too much. He is suffering too little. God is still being merciful. It could be worse. These are the friends. These are the men who traveled days to comfort him. And what they brought was not comfort. It was condemnation disguised as wisdom. And Job does not accept. Job refuses to confess a sin he did not commit. And here is something most people don't realize about the book of Job. It is not the story of a patient man. Popular tradition created the expression, the patience of Job. But read the text. Job is not patient. Job is furious. Job is combative. Job questions, argues, debates, demands, and confronts. Of the 42 chapters of the book, nearly 30 are an intense dispute between Job and his friends, and between Job and God himself. Job says things that would make any religious person of the time tremble. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? He accuses God of treating him as an adversary. If I have sinned, what have I done to you, you watcher of mankind? He questions what kind of God watches every human step just to punish. He even goes so far as to say, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. This phrase is the essence of Job. Even if God kills him, he will maintain his integrity. He will defend his innocence even before God himself, not out of arrogance, but because lying about himself would be betraying the truth. And Job would rather die honest than live lying. The 3 cycles of debate drag on for chapters. Eliphaz speaks, Job responds. Bildad speaks, Job responds. Zophar speaks, Job responds. Then they start again. And with each round, the friends become harsher and Job becomes bolder. Until in chapter 31, Job does something unprecedented in ancient literature. He pronounces an oath of innocence. He lists item by item everything he could have done wrong, and swears he did none of it. If I have walked with falsehood or my foot has hurried after deceit, let God weigh me in honest scales, and he will know that I am blameless. He swears he never coveted another man's wife, swears he never denied justice to his servant, swears he never ignored the poor, the widow, or the orphan, swears he never trusted in gold more than in God, swears he never rejoiced at an enemy's misfortune. Each oath is a direct challenge. If I lied, let God destroy me. If I did any of these things, let the punishment come. It is like signing a document with his own blood. Job is so certain of his innocence that he bets his life on it. And then, after 37 chapters of debate, accusation, defense, tears and silence, what no one expected happens. God answers, not through a prophet, not through a dream, not through a gentle voice. God answers from the midst of a whirlwind, a storm. The Hebrew text uses the word se'ara, a violent whirlwind, a vortex of wind and power that makes the earth tremble. And God's first words are not an explanation. They are not an apology. They are not a list of Job's sins. They are a question. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? And from that moment on, God asks Job more than 70 questions, and none of them are about Job's suffering. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand. Where were you when I separated the oceans, when I gave orders to the morning, when I marked out the path for the lightning? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Do you know how the hawk flies? Was it you who taught the eagle to build its nest on high? Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook? Can you tie down the jaw of a crocodile with a rope? Question after question after question, God does not answer why Job suffered. At no point, in no verse of the entire divine response, does God explain the suffering. He does not mention Satan. He does not mention the heavenly bet. He does not say it was a test. What God does is something completely different. He shows Job the scale of the universe, the scale of creation, the infinite complexity of a cosmos that functions by laws that no human mind can encompass. God does not say you deserved it. God says you don't have the frame to understand it. And Job's reaction is the second transformation of the book. The first was when he tore his robe and worshipped. This one is different. This one is deeper. Job 42.5. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. I had heard about you. All my life I knew about God. I heard the stories. I followed the commandments. I offered the sacrifices. But now on the other side of total loss, on the other side of suffering without explanation, on the other side of the ashes and the sores and the silence, now I see. The difference between hearing and seeing is the difference between knowing that fire burns and putting your hand in the flame. Job did not receive an intellectual answer. He received an experience. And that experience changed everything. And then, at the end, in the epilogue that many consider the most surprising part of the book, God turns to the three friends and says something that should make any theologian stop and think. Job 42.7. I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. God condemns the friends, the theologians, the ones who had the doctrine all right, the perfect system, and the ready answer. They were wrong. And Job, the one who questioned, who confronted, who screamed, who demanded answers, and who dared to say, I am innocent to God's own face. Job spoke what was right. This inverts everything the religious people of the time believed. Questioning is not a sin. Screaming in pain is not blasphemy. Demanding answers from God is not arrogance. It is the most honest form of faith there is. The friends sinned by being too certain. Job got it right by being too honest. The text ends with restoration. God gives Job double everything he had before. 14,000 sheep instead of 7,000. 6,000 camels instead of 3,000. 1,000 yoke of oxen instead of 500. 1,000 female donkeys instead of 500. And he had 10 more children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And here is a detail that generations of readers have noticed. The possessions were doubled, but the children were not. He had 10 before and 10 after, not 20. Why? Because according to rabbinic tradition, the children did not need to be doubled. They were not lost. They were with God. Job had 10 in heaven and 10 on earth. The total was 20, and the text makes a point of recording the names of the three daughters, Jemima, Keziah, and Keren Happuch, and adds that there were no women more beautiful in all the land. In a world where daughters were rarely named in records, the text names each one. In a world where female beauty was rarely celebrated in scripture, the text celebrates theirs. It is as if the restoration came with a different shine. Not just quantity but quality. Not just wealth but life. Job lived another 140 years after the restoration. He saw his children, his children's children, even to the fourth generation. And he died, the text says, old and full of days, full. Not tired, full, complete. A man who experienced the worst that human existence can offer, and on the other side found a fullness that prosperity alone had never given. And here is the question that crosses 3,000 years and falls into your lap now. What does the book of Job really teach? It's not that suffering always has an explanation, because Job never received one. It's not that God always rewards the faithful in the end, because millions of faithful people live and die without seeing material restoration. And it's not that we should accept everything in silence, because Job screamed, questioned, and confronted, and God said he spoke correctly. What the book of Job teaches is something harder and more liberating than any of those simple answers. It teaches that there is a category of suffering that is not punishment, not correction, and not the consequence of anything you did. There is pain that simply has no explanation accessible to the human mind. And faced with that pain, you have a choice. Not the choice between suffering and not suffering. That is not in your hands. But the choice between suffering with integrity or suffering without it. Job chose to maintain who he was, even when everything around him, possessions, health, family, friends, and even the logic of the universe that told him to give up. Perhaps you're going through something now that doesn't make sense. Perhaps you have done everything right, and yet things have gone wrong. Perhaps someone has already looked at you and said, just as Job's friends said, that you must have done something to deserve this. Perhaps you yourself have already wondered this on the nights when sleep doesn't come. The book of Job doesn't give you the answer to your pain, but it gives you something that is perhaps more important, the permission to feel, the permission to scream, the permission to look up and say, I don't understand, without that meaning weakness, without that meaning a lack of faith, and without that meaning sin. Because the man God called the best on earth did exactly that, and God said he spoke correctly. Job is not a fairy tale with a happy ending. It is the most honest portrait ancient literature has ever produced of what it means to be human in a world that doesn't always make sense. A man who had everything, lost everything, suffered beyond what anybody should endure, questioned the creator of the universe face to face. And in the end, not because he understood, but because he encountered, he lived again. Full of days, full of life, with scars that never disappeared, but that proved he survived. If you've made it this far, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I've set it aside especially for those who watch this one until the end. 7,000